I first noticed him sitting alone in a corner of a small roadside cafe, the kind people stop at when they don't know where else to go. He wasn't waiting for anyone. You could tell by the way he kept checking the door, not with hope, but with hesitation. His suitcase stood beside him, old and scratched, like it had traveled more than he had rested. I didn't know his name then. I only knew that he looked like someone who had returned from a long journey expecting relief, and instead found confusion. There's a specific look people get when reality doesn't match the version they carried in their head for years. His face had that look. Later, through quiet conversations and long pauses, I learned his story. He had spent most of his adult life working far from home. Not chasing dreams, not escaping responsibility, just trying to survive and provide. He believed that sending money, making calls, and promising soon was enough to hold a family together. Distance, he thought, was temporary. Love, he thought, would wait. But time doesn't pause for anyone. Children grow into strangers. Homes rearrange themselves. People learn to function without the ones who are absent, even if they never stop caring. As he stirred his untouched tea, he said something quietly, almost to himself. I thought coming back would feel like arriving. But arrival, I realized, doesn't always mean belonging. When he finally reached his house that evening, the door opened easily. Too easily. No hesitation, no rush, no sudden embrace that he had imagined so many times. He was welcomed, but carefully. The house looked familiar, yet different. New furniture. New routines. Even the silence had changed. Conversations flowed, but not around him. Decisions had already been made. Schedules already set. He listened more than he spoke, nodding politely, smiling when expected. No one was cruel. No one was unkind. And that made it worse. That night, he lay awake on a bed that didn't feel like his anymore. The walls held memories, but they didn't respond to him. He realized something deeply unsettling. His absence hadn't broken the family. It had taught them how to live without him. Providing from afar had kept them stable. But presence, real presence, had quietly slipped away. And lying there in the dark, surrounded by a life that no longer needed his role, he understood that coming home after years away isn't about walking through a door. It's about finding your place still exists. The next morning arrived quietly. He woke before anyone else, his body still trained by years of early shifts and unfamiliar time zones. The house was still, but it wasn't the comforting stillness he remembered. It felt organized, settled, as if everything already knew its place without him. He moved carefully, unsure of where things were kept. Cups were in different cabinets. Shoes lined the door in an order he didn't understand. Even the light switches felt unfamiliar under his fingers. Small things, but together they reminded him how much time had passed. When the others woke up, they greeted him kindly. Polite smiles. Simple questions. Did you sleep well? Are you tired? No one asked how it felt to be back. No one asked what he had imagined all these years. Maybe they assumed it didn't matter anymore. He tried to insert himself into conversations, offering suggestions about the day, but plans were already decided. Appointments scheduled. Errands assigned. Life moved smoothly, like a machine that had been running perfectly fine without his input. I noticed how his shoulders slowly pulled inward as the hours passed. Not from anger. From realization. He wasn't being ignored. He had simply returned to a story that had already moved ahead without him. That afternoon, he stepped outside alone. The street looked smaller than he remembered. Houses repainted. Children playing who didn't recognize him. He walked slowly, letting memories surface uninvited. This was where he once stood dreaming of a future that now felt distant. He sat on a bench and stared at his hands. Hands that had worked endlessly, sent money home, built a life he rarely lived in. He had believed sacrifice was enough. That absence could be justified by intention. I thought I was doing the right thing, he said quietly, not looking at me. And I understood what he meant. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was questioning a belief that had guided his entire life. The belief that love could survive without presence. That effort could replace closeness. The truth was heavier than regret. He hadn't failed them, but he had missed them. And missing years doesn't disappear just because you come back. As the sun dipped lower, he stayed seated, watching shadows stretch across the street. He wasn't sure where he fit anymore. And for the first time since returning, he admitted something he had been avoiding since the moment he arrived. Coming back was only the beginning. Rebuilding would be harder. In the days that followed, he tried to make himself useful. He offered to drive, to handle paperwork, to fix small things around the house. Each offer was met with appreciation, but also gentle refusal. It's already done. We have a system. Don't worry about it. Those words weren't meant to hurt, but they did. They reminded him that systems had been built in his absence. Life had adapted. People had learned to cope without waiting. One evening, he sat at the dining table long after dinner was finished. The others had moved on to their rooms, to their screens, to their routines. He remained, staring at an empty plate, fingers tracing the edge slowly. I used to imagine this table, he said quietly. I thought if I could just get back here, everything would fall into place. I didn't interrupt. Some realizations need space to settle. He wasn't angry at anyone. That was the hardest part. There was no one to blame. Time had done what time always does, it moved forward, taking relationships with it unless they were lived in, daily, imperfectly. One afternoon, he went through old boxes stored in a closet. Letters he had written. Receipts from money transfers. Photos he carried in his wallet for years. Proof that he had cared, that he had tried. He sat on the floor surrounded by evidence of effort, yet none of it could replace presence. None of it could fill birthdays missed, conversations delayed, moments postponed. I gave them everything I had, he whispered. And he had. Just not the one thing that can't be sent from far away, himself. That realization didn't break him immediately. It settled slowly, like dust after a long fall. He began to understand that returning wasn't about reclaiming authority or position. It was about learning how to exist quietly in a life that had learned to function without him. That night, he made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Just a quiet shift inside himself. If he was going to stay, he wouldn't demand space. He would earn it slowly, patiently, day by day. After that quiet decision, his behavior changed in small ways. He stopped offering help loudly and started noticing instead. He learned when the house was most active and when it needed calm. He listened more than he spoke. When plans were discussed, he waited until asked. At first, no one noticed. And that hurt. But he reminded himself that rebuilding trust doesn't announce itself. It happens in repetition, in consistency, in showing up without expectations. One evening, someone asked him for advice on a small matter. Nothing important. Just an opinion. He answered carefully, without trying to control the outcome. The conversation moved on naturally. Later, he told me, it felt small, but it mattered. And it did. Because it was the first time his presence fit into the rhythm of the house instead of interrupting it. Days passed. Then weeks. He stayed. Not out of pride, not out of obligation, but out of choice. He began taking walks with one family member at a time, short conversations without pressure. No apologies. No explanations. Just listening. He laughed quietly at a joke one afternoon, surprised at himself. It had been a long time since laughter felt natural. One night, he admitted something he had never said out loud before. I was afraid that if I came back, I wouldn't matter anymore. I didn't answer immediately. Some truths don't need responses. They just need to be spoken. He wasn't trying to reclaim the past. He was learning how to exist in the present. And that takes more courage than leaving ever did. Slowly, without ceremony, the house began to adjust to him again. Not as the center, not as the provider, but as a person flawed, present, and finally real. One afternoon, he found himself alone in the living room, holding an old photo frame. It showed a younger version of himself standing proudly beside his family, taken just before he left. He stared at it for a long time, trying to recognize the man he used to be. That man had believed distance was temporary, that love could be paused. He placed the frame back gently, as if returning something fragile to its place. "I don't want to be a memory anymore," he said quietly. From that day on, he started showing up in ways that didn't demand attention. Sitting nearby during conversations, being present during quiet evenings, accepting that some moments would pass without him, and that was okay. I watched him learn something difficult. Belonging isn't reclaimed, it's rebuilt. There was a small moment that changed everything. Someone asked him to stay back one evening, just to talk. No urgency, no agenda, just company. He listened more than he spoke, nodding slowly, asking simple questions. When the conversation ended, there was no awkward silence, only comfort. Later, he said to me, "I think this is how it starts." He wasn't talking about forgiveness. He was talking about trust. The quiet kind that forms when people stop bracing themselves. He went to bed that night lighter than he had been since returning. Not because everything was fixed, but because something had shifted. He was no longer standing outside the circle, waiting to be invited in. He was already there. Weeks passed, and he began noticing small details that had escaped him before. The way a child laughed at an inside joke he hadn't heard. The subtle patterns of conversation that showed who made decisions and when. He realized the family had grown in his absence, not replacing him, but adjusting, surviving, living. At first, it stung. Every adaptation reminded him of what he had missed. But slowly, he began to see it differently. These changes weren't barriers, they were bridges. Bridges he could cross gently, without demanding the space he once took for granted. He started asking questions. Not intrusive, just curious. "How did you manage this day? What did you decide together?" Each answer taught him patience. Each story reminded him that life had moved on, but he still had a place if he approached it humbly. One evening, he sat quietly by the window, watching shadows stretch across the street. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "I thought coming back would feel like arrival. But it feels like learning." And I understood. Returning isn't a destination. It's a slow process, a series of small choices, small acknowledgments, small connections that, over time, knit someone back into a life that has already moved forward. He began to see that being present didn't mean being central. It didn't mean control or authority. It meant noticing, listening, participating when invited, and allowing others to shape the rhythm of the home. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was enough. Slowly, the family began to rely on him, not because they had to, but because they could trust he was there, quietly steady, ready if needed. And that, more than anything, felt like belonging. By now, he had learned to move without expectation. He didn't try to fix things unnecessarily. He didn't offer advice unless asked. He simply observed, listened, and occasionally acted in ways that added ease rather than disruption. One morning, he helped carry groceries, but this time, he asked first what was needed. The small interaction, simple and unremarkable to anyone else, felt monumental to him. He realized that presence wasn't measured in grand gestures. It was measured in respect, attentiveness, and patience. Later, he walked with one family member through the park. They didn't talk much, but the silence was comfortable. He noticed the subtle smiles, the way steps synced without effort, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years, acceptance. Not forgiveness. Not attention. Acceptance. He began to understand that rebuilding a relationship doesn't happen in one moment. It happens in hundreds of quiet moments, repeated patiently, without expectation or judgment. And in that understanding, he finally began to feel at home. That evening, he sat alone in the living room, reflecting on the weeks since his return. He thought of the time spent abroad, the lonely nights, the sacrifices made with good intentions. He realized that those years had shaped him, yes, but they had also created distance that could only be bridged through humility and effort. He whispered softly to the empty room, "I'm here now. I'll stay here. I'll listen, I'll notice, I'll try." No one responded immediately, but that wasn't necessary. He didn't need applause. He needed patience, his own and theirs. Later, a small gesture came unexpectedly. A shared laugh over a memory, a question about something only he could answer, a glance that acknowledged his presence without words. It was enough. That night, as he prepared for bed, he understood something vital. Returning home isn't about reclaiming a place. It's about earning it again, quietly, one step at a time. And he was ready for every step. The night was quiet. He sat by the window, hands resting on the sill, watching the faint glow of the streetlights. Everything was still, yet full of life, people moving, laughter drifting from a neighbor's home, the subtle rhythm of a house that had grown without him. He took a deep breath and realized something profound. Returning wasn't about regaining what he had lost. It was about learning to live in a life that had continued without him, embracing the moments he could be present, and letting go of the ones he couldn't reclaim. He had spent years thinking love could survive distance, that absence could be justified by effort. But now he understood, love is in showing up, quietly, patiently, and consistently. Not with grand gestures, but with attention, humility, and choice. A soft smile crossed his face as he felt the subtle warmth of belonging return. He didn't need validation. He didn't need acknowledgement. He simply needed to exist in the rhythm of this home, as a participant, not an intruder. And in that stillness, he finally felt it, the quiet certainty that he was part of the life again, not as the person who had left, but as the person who had returned. For the first time in years, he felt at home, fully, quietly, and without doubt. And he knew that this, patience, presence, understanding, was the truest form of love he could give and receive. The past could not be undone. The years lost could not return. But here, now, he was enough. Whole, present, and finally free.